It was on the first day of the week that God said, "Let there be light," and began the work of the old creation. It was on the first day of the week that he began his work of new creation. And in fact, it was on this day that Jesus rose from the dead, and his physical body was the first part of the new creation to be made. And it was on this day that the Holy Spirit was sent down. It is an exciting day because Sunday is the first day of the new creation. That's not my theme for tonight. It was just what was going through my mind and heart as we sang those two choruses. Now, I have decided not to press on tonight with the question of evolution, but to hold it for just another time and to go straight into a study tonight of the creation of men. On the first evening we had together, we looked at God. On the second evening, we looked at the world, but tonight I felt we should consider man. And then, having seen all that the Bible says, then we can look at some of the problems that science is raising. But I just got a sense this week that God does not want science to set the agenda. He wants Scripture to set the agenda, and then we can face the problems that science raises. So I felt we should press on tonight and look at man and his origin, his nature, his relationships that are written down for us in Genesis, the end of chapter 1 and the whole of chapter 2 for tonight. So let me start reading at verse 26 of chapter 1, and again I'll read a paraphrase just to make it fresh. At this point, God reached a momentous decision. Now let us make some different creatures, more our kind, human beings, just like us. They can be in charge of all the others, the fish in the sea, the birds of the air, and the animals on the land. To resemble himself, God created mankind, to reflect in themselves his heart, will, and mind, to relate to each other, male and female entwined. Then he affirmed their unique position with words of generous encouragement. Produce many offspring, for you are to occupy and control the whole earth. The fish in the sea, the birds of the air, and the animals on the land are all yours to master. I am also giving you seed-bearing plants and fruit-bearing trees as your food supply. The birds and the beasts can have the green leaves for their food. And so it was. God surveyed everything he had made, and he was very satisfied. It was all so right, so beautiful. Outer space and planet Earth were now complete in all their vastness and variety. Since nothing more was needed, God took a break the next day. This is why he designated each seventh day as a special day, set apart from the others as a day for himself alone, because on that day he was not busy with what had been his daily work. This is how our universe was born, and how everything in it came to be the way it is. During the time the God who is was producing outer space and planet Earth, there was a time when there was no vegetation at all on the ground. And if there had been, there was neither any rain to irrigate it, nor any man to cultivate it. But underground water welled up to the surface and watered the soil. And the God who is molded a human body from tiny particles of clay, gave it the kiss of life, and man joined the living creatures. Now the God who is had already laid out a stretch of parkland east of here, in a place called Eden, which means delight, and he brought the first man there to live. The God who is had planted a great variety of trees in the park with beautiful foliage and delicious fruit. Right in the middle were two rather special trees. The fruit of one could maintain life indefinitely, while the fruit of the other gave the eater personal experience of right and wrong. One river watered the whole area, but divided into 4 watercourses as it left the park. One was called the Pishon, and wound across the entire length of Havilah, the land where pure nuggets of gold were later found, as well as aromatic resin and onyx. The second was called the Gihon, and meandered right through the country of Cush. The third is the present Tigris, which flows in front of the city of Ashur, and the fourth is the present Euphrates. So the God who is put this man in the parkland of delight to develop and protect it. And the God who is gave him very clear orders. You are perfectly free to eat the fruit of any tree except one, the tree that brings experience of right and wrong. If you taste that, you will have to be put to death. Then the God who is thought aloud, it isn't right for the man to be all on his own. I will provide him with a matching partner. Now the God who is had fashioned all sorts of birds and beasts out of the soil, and he brought them in contact with the man to see how he would describe them. And whatever the man said about each one became its name. So the man labeled all the other creatures, but in none of them did he see a real companion for himself. So the God who is sent the man into a deep coma, and while he was unconscious, he took tissue from the side of his body and pulled the flesh together over the gap. Then with the tissue, he produced a female clone and introduced her to the man. And Adam burst out, "At last you have granted my wish, a companion with my bones and flesh. Woman to me is her name. By coming from man she's the same." That explains why a man lets go of his parents and holds on to his wife, their two bodies fusing into one again. The first man and his new wife wandered about the park quite bare, without the slightest embarrassment. Right, well, I hope that brought it freshly to you. It is one of the world's leading evolutionists, a man called Eaton, who said that man must be one of the most improbable productions of the universe. And those who believe that we're simply an accident, a biological mistake, are the first to say that if man had not appeared once, then it is almost certain he would never have appeared again. Such are the statistical chances against someone like me appearing on planet Earth. That's how the evolutionists say. But am I a mistake? Am I a cosmic orphan? Am I someone who was not wanted and simply happened? Is it pure chance that men appeared on this planet Earth? If that is so, then frankly life is absurd, it is meaningless, it is a sick joke. And that's where we are left if I'm an accident and the result of chance rather than choice. It would mean that when I got to the end of my life, I would say, I have missed the point. And then I would ask, but was there any point to miss? And I can think of nothing more devastating to a human being than to tell them they were not wanted. They are an accident, and there is no point in them being here. It is quite devastating. Which means that there are thousands of people alive today who are suffering what is called a crisis of identity. I remember a man who rang me up at 3 o'clock in the morning. He'd had a drink or two first, and he would always prime the pump before he ever rang me up, and so the telephone used to go at very ungodly hours, and at 3 o'clock in the morning I'm not a very good Christian. But I remember him ringing up and saying, "Who am I? Who am I?" And this is the fundamental question. I guess most of us go through a teenage crisis of identity when we look in the mirror and think, who am I? When you first begin to shave or when you grow up a bit and you think, who am I really? And you go through that crisis. Everybody does in their teens. But the vast majority of adults never get through that crisis. And they still do not know who they are. Where do we fit in? If there is a script, what role do I play? Or is life simply a journey from nowhere to nowhere? Now, the two brothers, Johnny and Desmond Morris, have done all they can to persuade me that I'm an animal. Johnny Morris does it by looking at animals and seeing human beings, and his brother Desmond does it by looking at human beings and seeing animals, and calling us naked apes. But those two brothers between them have conveyed to me that I am just an animal. And if that's all you can say about me, you mustn't blame me for behaving as if I'm in a jungle. It is certainly true that functionally I can be classified with animals. Functionally, I am a mammal. Functionally, I inhabit the same environment as the animals. And indeed, Genesis puts my creation in the same day as the animals. And there are many similarities. Yet there are two things that puzzle me if I'm nothing more than an animal. And both concern the fact that I do not feel really at home in this world, nor does any person. The animals do, but I don't. And I have yet to meet a human being who felt totally at home in this world. Yet the animals obviously do. And the two things that worry me about being told I'm an animal are these. Number one, I can rise far above the animals. And number two, I can fall way below them. I can act a good deal better than they can and a good deal worse. And the range of my experience is far wider than the animals, far above them and far below them. Far above them I could list a whole host of things, but they're so obvious you hardly need me to tell you. In language, in arts, in culture, in just asking questions. I don't know an animal that asks a question. And my ability to ask questions means that I can think about this world. No animal does. No animal knows what this world once was. And no animal can think about what it will yet be. There is a whole range of mental activity. There's a whole range of emotional life. There's a whole range of moral experience. So far as I know, there is no such thing as a good dog. I've heard them often called that when they've been taught a Pavlovian reaction to beg for food. But a dog has never thought in terms of being good and has never felt any shame at being bad, just fear of punishment. So there is no such thing as a good dog. Indeed, Jesus said there's no such thing as a good man. Don't call anyone good but God only, which is quite a sobering thought. And we use the phrase so glibly that we talk about a good meal. But there's a whole range of moral experience which no animal has. There's a range of spiritual experience which no animal has. I've not yet seen an animal put its paws together and pray. There is no trace of spiritual or religious activity in the whole animal world, not anywhere. So that in all these areas, man can rise so far above the animals that it raises a question as to whether he is one. But then the opposite is also true, and this is shattering, that men can sink way below the animals. I pick out just two areas, sex and violence. I have yet to meet an animal who engages in kinky sex. And I have yet to meet a species that has an Auschwitz for another species. And in these areas alone, and there are others I could list, man falls far below the animals. And we talk about man behaving in a bestial fashion or a beastly fashion. I think that's an insult to the beasts. Because the hairy apes do not behave as badly as the naked ones. Now, in these two things, not only in our ability to rise above animals, but our ability to fall way below them, there is something unique about man which separates him radically in a difference of kind and not just degree from the animals. And this wide spectrum of experience leaves us floundering around, not really knowing where we belong. We swing from the sensual to the spiritual. We swing from materialism to high moral aspiration. In every one of us there's a desire to be a saint and an enjoyment of being a sinner. And we flounder around in this world. We want a heaven. And since this earth is not very heavenly, we're constantly looking for some other place that would be heaven to live. And yet, earth is our home. And man becomes a riddle. I came across a verse of a poem this week by Alexander Pope, which summed it up superbly. He wrote, "Created half to rise and half to fall, great Lord of all things, yet a prey to all, sole judge of truth in endless errors hurled, the glory, jest, and riddle of the world." That just about sums me up. The glory, jest, and riddle of the world. A complete, crazy, mixed-up kid. The boy who went to school with a New Jersey B-A-I-K embroidered on it, was asked, what does that mean? And he said, boy, am I confused. And they said, you don't spell confused with a K, you spell it with a C. And he said, boy, you don't know how confused I am. And H.G. Wells wrote about a character called Mr. Polly, and he says of Mr. Polly, he was not so much a human being as a civil war. And this describes just the sentence of St. Paul, the good I would I do not, and the evil that I would not that I do, just sums up this floundering being called man, who wonders where he fits in, and has often come to the conclusion that in fact he is a misfit. Now all that summary I've given you so far, you could glean from humanist literature, from arts, from novels, but you won't get it in the Bible. What you get in the Bible is an explanation about this strange being that I am. I am not a misfit, but I am a hybrid. I'm a crossbred person. I belong to two worlds, not one. And I'll never really feel at home till those two have become one. I belong to heaven and to earth, which is why my future destiny is not in heaven, and that's naive Christian teaching. My future destiny is in a new heaven and a new earth. And I don't know when I last heard a sermon on the new earth. I've heard plenty on heaven, but none on the new earth. But it's precisely because I'm a creature of two worlds that I need to live in a new heaven and a new earth. And my constant inconsistency and contradiction and wavering from one world to the other is due to the fact that I'm a hybrid. I've come from two places. I've come from a subhuman and a superhuman source. And that's why I feel trapped in this world. This world is not my home, and yet it has to be. Well, now that's an introduction to what the Bible says about the beginnings of man. Because as with Alex Haley, as I mentioned the first evening, to go back to your roots is to discover who you are. Because Alex Haley found himself living outwardly the life of a white American, but inwardly living a life of a black African, and he couldn't figure it out. There were two kind of worlds in his heart tugging him, and he had to go back to Africa to find his origins, to understand why he felt as he did. And we're going to go back to our origins. Now, first we go back to see what Genesis 1 says about man, and then we'll look more fully at Genesis 2. Genesis 1 says a bit. At first sight, it looks as if it's saying we're part of the animal kingdom, created on the sixth day with the rest of the animals to inhabit the same environment. But in fact, Genesis 1 puts the emphasis on the difference between animals and men. And there are 10 differences listed in Genesis 1 between animals and men. Now, you can either jot them down quickly or you can go home and try and dig them out for yourself. Some of them are a bit subtle, others are very obvious. The first one is fairly subtle and may not come out in an English translation. And it is this, that all the way through Genesis 1 in the Hebrew, it says day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and then it says on the sixth day. It singles out that day as the most important of all six. As if something happened on that day that put all the others into the shade. The second thing that indicates a difference is that man is the last creative act. With man, creation's over. It's finished. There is no higher creation. He is the grand finale. He is the climax. And it's interesting that science agrees with Scripture here, that man was the final creative thing to appear. The third difference is that with the animals, God simply made a decision and issued an order and said, let there be. But with man, God held a conference first. And for the first time, the word us appears. And it's certainly not the royal we. I've read commentators who say, oh, well, the plural here is just royal we, like the Queen saying, we are going to Balmoral. But do you remember I told you that the verbs are singular? Can you imagine Her Majesty the Queen saying, we am going to Windsor? If you're going to be royal, you're consistent with it. And yet all the way through Genesis, it's we am. And I explained that to you, that it's the first hint that God is a family, not just one person. And that the word is used as plural, not dual for two, but plural for three. And so he calls the other two in and he says, now let's have a little conference. Let's do something all together. Whereas before, as I told you, he has been simply issuing orders to the Holy Spirit who was hovering over the chaos and who was carrying out what Father said. Now he calls them together. And he says, let's make something special. Just like us. Now there's almost, can you sense that God is just catching his breath a bit? Did you get that feel? That God is sort of pausing before this last one, as if there's something terribly important going to happen. Come together, now let's. Do you get that sense? I may be reading too much into this, but I just get the sense that God was realizing the risk he was taking with this last step. It was going to be the crown of creation, but it could be the crucifixion of it at the same time. He was going to create a being capable of being a companion to him, capable of having relationships with him, but also capable of rebellion, capable of messing the whole thing up. If he'd stopped with the animals, the creation would have perfectly obeyed his will forever. I almost get the feeling of a bachelor who's got a lovely house and dogs and a budgerigar and a beautiful garden full of flowers and is very happy with it all and is wondering whether to get married. Wondering whether having a wife will spoil the whole thing. Do you know what I mean? Because realizing that another person in that situation with a will of their own is going to be very different from a nice garden and a pets and a beautiful house. I just get that sense that God is just pausing and saying, it's a big step, this. Something terribly important is going to happen. Could ruin the whole thing. I just sense a kind of pause and a bated breath. But it makes men quite different from the animals, this let us. The fourth thing is that the word created not only is used for the third time only in chapter 1, but is used 3 times for this one creature. Now that's never happened before. As if God is emphasizing 3 times that this is a new departure that would not have happened if he hadn't decided. So the idea that man naturally descended from animals is just contrary to scriptural teaching. Man would not have appeared unless God had decided something quite different was to be brought into being. And I think the evolutionist is just plain blind when he can make the statement that he does make, that man is the most improbable creature to have appeared, and not realize that it was the result of a deliberate decision. On his own premises, it is so unlikely that a man would have appeared. But God said, let's do it. All makes sense. I will show you next time that the fossil record is far more consistent with creation than with what is popularly called evolution. The next thing, difference number 5, God bursts into poetry. Now you only do that when your heart is being touched. Prose is for the head, poetry is for the heart. And when love comes into the picture, you invariably start writing poetry. And all the way up till now, God has simply described in prose, I said this, and it happened, and I did that, and it happened, and now suddenly he's into poetry. He doesn't write poetry about the plants, he doesn't write poetry about the animals, he isn't a William Wordsworth. But he writes poetry about man, as if he's saying, this is touching my heart. Difference number 6 is the most obvious one. He says, man will be in our image, our likeness. Now, I've seen so much ink spilled about which part of man is like God. Well, let's just look at some of the answers. People usually say, well, of course, our bodies are not like God because God is spirit and doesn't have a body. I'm not sure that that's valid thinking. It's right that God doesn't have a body. It's wrong to say that my body is not like him, because everything I can do with my body, he can do without one. And that's why there's no problem in the Bible about talking about the eyes of God, the ears of God, the nostrils of God, the mouth of God, the hand of God, the arm of God, the kidneys of God, the heart of God, the feet of God. You'll find that my whole body corresponds in some way to the functions that God fulfills without a body. So I'm not prepared to rule out my body as being in the likeness of God. Otherwise you're left with an impossible Bible that's full of references to such things. Now, God doesn't have a body, but what I'm saying is everything my hand can do, he can do without a hand. So that I can look at my hand and think about the hand of God, and it doesn't distort my understanding. Mentally, I'm intelligent. I don't know what my quotient is, but I can think, I can reflect, I have an appreciation of truth. And God is like that too. And then aesthetically, I have an appreciation of beauty, so does God. Morally, I'm aware of the fact there is a difference between right and wrong, even if my conscience has been conditioned by my upbringing. I know there are lines to be drawn, and that's something I got from God. I could go on and make a whole long list of the different things that in me are like God, but I just want to say it's the whole thing that's like God, not parts. I think we make a big mistake if we say which part of you is like God. The whole of you is like God. It's all these things put together, and just to try and find a bit of God in someone is, I think, to approach it wrongly. He made man in his image, not a bit of man, but the whole being is like God, which means that God is like man. And that's revolutionary. That's why it's so foolish to make a golden calf and say that's God. You've moved much further away from God if you look at an animal. It's man who's like God. And you should be able to look at everybody in the tube train or on the bus and say, God's like that person sitting over there. You should see his image there, however distorted, however covered up. There's an image of God, which the Bible teaches no man loses. It's interesting that the image isn't such a spiritual thing that only believers have it. Unbelievers, wicked sinners, are said in the Bible still to be in the image of God and to have his likeness in them. And that gives every human being a dignity. That's what stops euthanasia. That's what stops abortion. That's what stops killing off the mentally retarded. Because there's an image, a resemblance there. And it's one truth that we really need to recover in our society. When you lose that truth, you finish up with inhumanity and injustice. But it's the whole that's in the image. The next thing I want to say is, not only is God like us, but it means that a human being is capable of containing the Godhead. Now think of that. You see, if this is not true, what we're saying in Genesis 1, then it is not true that the fullness of the Godhead dwelt in Jesus bodily. But you see, Charles Wesley in his hymn says it in an amazing way. Our God contracted to a span, incomprehensibly made man. And the fullness of the Godhead got into a human body under 6 feet tall in Jesus. There is an incredible connection in here that we need to almost take our shoes off and wonder at. I am like God. Therefore God is like me. Therefore it is possible for God to be a human being. And the incarnation is possible because men were made in the image of God. The seventh difference is in the male and female. Now, astonishingly, Genesis 1 says that the male and female character of mankind links us with God rather than the animals. Now, most people make the very fundamental mistake of thinking that's something we got from animals. But Genesis 1 says, in the image of God created he them, male and female he created them. In other words, God could not put his image into just one person. Now think of that. That he had to create complementary natures. Now to me it's an amazing thing about Jesus that he was never married, but I have yet to meet a woman who does not feel that Jesus understands her perfectly. But the normal human life is this: since God is not one person all on his own, but three in perfect oneness, he decided to just reduce that by one and make mankind two in oneness, so that we might understand that no one person is complete. God is a society, mankind is a society. Now that doesn't mean that everybody's got to be married. Jesus wasn't, Paul wasn't, many have not. But woe betide a man who thinks he does not need women, or a woman who thinks she does not need men. We need each other. Not just in marriage, but in society. There are complementary natures that need each other. And if we're to understand God fully, you need to look at men and women together. If you want to see his image, you need to look at both. Now that's, in animals, male and female is simply a reproductive thing. It is not an image of God. But in Genesis 1, the male and female distinction in the human race is godlike rather than animal-like. Again, I'll leave you to work out the implications. Number 8, what God says to man, he does not say to any other creature. Now, he did say to the fish and the fowls, increase, multiply, fill, and he said the same to men. But then he went on to say to man, and I put you in charge of all the other creatures. He never said that to any animal. But to man he says, you are to subdue. You're in charge. You're in control. That sets man apart from the animals. Number 9, man's food is to be different from animals' food. Man is to eat the fruit of the tree. The leaves are for the animals. Or literally, the grass is for the animals. Do you know, I tell you 2 stories to underline this. King Nebuchadnezzar, that great ruler of Babylon, who got so big-headed that one night as he walked through the gardens, the hanging gardens, which were one of the 7 wonders of the world, on top of his palace, he said, is not this great Babylon my kingdom, which I have built by my power and for my glory? He had his own version of the Lord's Prayer, which was, mine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. And God put his hand on that man, and a few days later he was stark, staring mad. And it says his nails grew long and his hair grew long, just like Howard Hughes in his last days. And it says he was eating grass like the cattle. As much as say, that is what he sank to. A friend of mine is a missionary in India. And he said one of the most awful things that happened to him. He was sitting down for his meal one day with his wife. And he looked out of the door, and there was a poor Indian man dressed in rags with a few children hanging onto his hand, coming up the path to the bungalow door. And this Indian knocked at his door and said to my friend, please, could my children graze your lawn? And this Indian was so desperate to get food for his children that he wanted them to come and get down and eat the grass. And my friend said something went right through him. They were so hungry they were ready to do it. And when he saw children getting down and grazing, he just couldn't face it. You see, there is some profound distinction here. Can you feel it? Now, giving somebody fruit from your fruit tree, you wouldn't think twice about children doing that. But seeing them graze your lawn, how would you feel? God made a distinction between animals and men, even in the food line. We do not graze like animals. And the 10th distinction was that God gave men a week to be his cycle of activity. Now, that is not a natural division. No animal or bird observes the week. Nature observes lunar months by the moon and solar years by the sun. It never observes weeks. I wish they had when I used to get up at 4 in the morning and milk 90 cows every morning before breakfast. They didn't observe Sunday at all. And I can remember falling asleep in the pew of the church again and again because I'd been up and doing all that work, and I wished the cows would take a day off, but they never observed a week. Animals have no concept of the week or the weekend. It is purely a spiritual thing for man. The Sabbath was made for man, and it links him with God, not the animal world. And the whole concept of the week, mark my words, vanishes if God vanishes from society. And you'll lose your Sunday fairly quickly as Britain becomes more pagan. It is one of the things that marks us out from the animals. The animals don't have a week, but we do, because on the 7th day God rested and said, now if you're going to be human, you will need 1 day and 7 to rise above what animals do, make a living. You'll need to rise above just eating, drinking, and marrying and getting your food. And you'll need to be human and remember who you are 1 day a week. But the week is built into us. We take a week normally, don't we? We just assume it's normal, but no animal ever did. So in these 10 ways, add all those 10 things up, and you get an equation which says man is not an animal. And that's just in a handful of verses in the Bible, and we found at least 10 differences. Well, now we turn to Genesis 2. And the first thing we've got to say is that many people say Genesis 2 is a second alternative account of creation, and that it's come from a different source. Have you heard this, some of you? And that you can take your pick, but it's written so differently that they're almost contradictory. Well, now, I want to show you that that is not so. They are very different in style, in order, in range, in viewpoint. But they are complementary. They're not alternatives. They're supplements. They are looking at the same story from two angles. Now, this is often God's way in the Bible. In fact, to portray Jesus, he had to give us 4 angles on Jesus. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. God doesn't mind repeating himself, but usually through the Bible he tells you a thing twice. Right through the Old Testament, he often gives us 2 accounts of the same thing from different angles so we get the picture. Now, I hope you never have a mug shot in the police station, but if they ever get you, they'll take 2 shots, one like that and one like that. And in one you'll have 1 ear, and in the other you'll have 2 ears. And somebody could say, well, I think he only has 1 ear. And some could say, well, I think he has 2. But in fact, you need the 2 shots to get a full picture of the man. So if you get your mug shot, that's what you'll get. And Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are 2 snapshots, 2 movie films of creation. Now let's have the first transparency, could we? C1, thank you. And I just want to show you the contrast of viewpoint between these 2. They have a different view of God, and they have a different view of men. And funnily enough, on both, they're the opposite way round. In chapter 1, God is like man, because man is like God. But in chapter 2, God is very different from man. In chapter 1, man is like God, but in chapter 2, man is very unlike God. And in fact, both are true. And if you want a full picture of God and man, it's not enough to say God is like man without saying God is also unlike man. And it's not enough to say man is like God, because it is also true he is unlike God. And it's as if God has given us 2 different viewpoints to give us the whole truth and balance it out. Now, do you ever shut your eyes after you've read a portion of the Bible and ask, where are you standing? I don't think many of you do. You're looking a bit blank. For example, you know when you read that parable of the Pharisee up at the front of the temple saying, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, and the man at the very back of the temple beating his breast and saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. Do you know that story? When you read that story, where do you stand? Where do you look to see the man at the back? And where do you look to see the man at the front? If you're like me, you say, well, I'm neither, so I put myself halfway down. And mentally, I find myself looking at the man up front and looking back at the man at the back. Do you see what I mean? You place yourself. Now, as I read Genesis 1, I feel that I am just below the clouds. I'm up in the air and watching it happen. Do you see what I mean? When I read Genesis 1, I find myself looking down at the dry land appearing and looking up at the clouds, and I find myself hovering above the surface of the earth. If you think a bit, I think you'll find that's where you find yourself looking. But you've probably never thought about it, so you never realize it. But you're hovering above the thing, but you're not up where God is, and you're not down on the surface of the earth. You're watching it from just a bit out, right? Do you realize that's where the Holy Spirit was while it was all happening? He was hovering above the waters. And it was the Holy Spirit who conveyed Genesis 1 to man. And so you find yourself exactly where he was. Does that make sense to you? Are you following me, or am I getting a bit too deep for you? Well, in Genesis 2, where do you find yourself? Hiding behind a tree. Right? Your feet are on the ground in Genesis 2. Right? You read it through. And you'll find yourself, you're in the garden, and your feet are on the ground. You're not hovering up, looking down at it. The viewpoint is of someone in the garden, which is precisely where Adam was. And since we get this from Adam now, he wasn't around in Genesis 1. So he couldn't tell us, but he was around in Genesis 2. And has clearly passed on. We have his viewpoint. We've switched from the divine to the human viewpoint. We've switched from where the Spirit was hovering to where Adam was walking. And in fact, we're just round the back of a tree listening in on the conversation. That's where you are. And that's the viewpoint. Now, from those two viewpoints, you'll get the whole truth, from the divine and the human. You will see the real truth. And from the divine viewpoint, man is like God, not the animals. But from the human point of view, down here on earth, we're much more like the animals than God. Do you follow? That's what we feel. Because we're down here, and we're in the same environment. Now, that difference of perspective is very important, because with Genesis 2, we begin history and geography. We begin the actual events of the story of our human race, and the places are now actual, literal places with names. And one of the biggest differences of all between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is that both God and man now have names. As long as it was just God and his world, there was no intimacy, no relationship that needed names, because the world didn't talk to God and God didn't talk to the world directly. He spoke to his spirit. But now in Genesis 2, there's relationships. And now names are needed. And one of the first things you must have noticed is that whereas in Genesis 1 it's God said, God saw, in Genesis 2 it's Lord God did, and Lord God saw. And that word Lord in capital letters is a bit of a mistranslation. They've just put it there wherever there is a strange list of 4 letters in the Hebrew. J-H-V-H. And since most English people don't know how to pronounce Hebrew, they usually say Jehovah. So when an Englishman says Jehovah, the Hebrew doesn't know what he means. And when a Hebrew says Yahweh, the English doesn't. It's interesting, the Jerusalem Bible, the Roman Catholic Bible, does put Yahweh in there. And that is God's name. God is not a name. It's a title. It's a description. But Yahweh is a name. It's as if you say, oh, look at baby George. Now, baby isn't a name. That tells you what he is, but George tells you who he is. Do you understand? Or if you say, our shop steward, Joe. Now, shop steward tells you what he is, but Joe tells you who he is, right? And God doesn't tell you who God is, it tells you what he is. But Lord tells you who he is. And it's a strange name. It comes from the verb to be, and we're not quite sure whether it's a participle or the root of the verb or what. But it just means being, is, am. I don't know quite how to translate it. I just translated it, the God who is. It's almost as if God says, my name is. But since that sort of sounds a little silly to us, let's just go a little further and use the translation maybe that is used in many English versions, I am. That's why they tried to stone Jesus when he called himself that. It means, I've always been here. I always will be here. Whatever else exists, I will always exist. The world wasn't always here. You weren't always here, but I was. I am. I'm the God who is. So when you want to refer to me, you refer to me as is. The God who is. I am. Tremendous name. And it means that now I can have a personal relationship with him. But notice that it's not an equal relationship. In an equal relationship, you give each other names. But in this relationship, God gives himself his name, and he gives us our name. It's a bit one-sided in a sense. It's the relationship of a superior to an inferior. And we need to remember that all the time. We should not get pally with the deity. We should remember always that though we are his sons, and he's told us to call him Dad, he never says we're equals. And we never will be, so we really must watch this. So he gives himself his name, I am, the God who is. And he gives us our name. He says, hello, Dusty. That's what Adam means. It is a nickname. And nicknames always describe the person. Have you noticed? Fatty, describes him, doesn't it? Oh, here comes old miserable. Nicknames describe. And Adam simply means dust. I could have said mud, but I thought that was a little too... or else You could call him Clay. Hello, Clay. I'm just going to call you Dusty. Later, Adam called his wife Lively. So they were quite a pair, Dusty and Lively. But I want to convey to you the real meaning of the names, you know. We tend, you know, to put a halo around biblical names and put them in a stained glass window and say, Adam, you know. Dusty. It's a constant reminder to him of his place. I am the God who is. Hello, Dusty. I got you from the dust, and that's where you're going back. Mummy, there's somebody coming and going under the spare room bed, as the little girl said. From dust we come, and to dust we shall return. Well, that's chapter 2. I thought some of you were a little slow on that one. That's chapter 2 on God. Now look at chapter 2 on men. And if chapter 1 emphasizes man's difference from the animals, chapter 2 emphasizes his similarity. In fact, everything it says about the creation of man in chapter 2 is identical with what is said about the animals. But I'm afraid that is often misinterpreted, especially by that dreadful word soul, as if somehow God put something very special called a soul into man. In fact, the Hebrew, you must take my word for it, it says exactly the same about man as it says about all the animals. And it only says two things in Genesis 2 about man. Number one, he was made out of the ground. That every particle in his body came from the soil. There isn't a single thing in my body that you can't find in the ground somewhere. And it says twice that out of the ground he made the animals. So I have exactly the same origin as the animals, in that they and I came out of the soil. And that's where we came from. So God took of the dust of the earth. That's what he did with the animals too. He is saying, you're not so different. You're the same as the animals. I'm treating you the same way. And the second thing that is said here is that God breathed into Adam, quite literally gave him the kiss of life. And from his mouth to Adam's nostrils, he just filled his lungs with air. And Adam became a living creature, which is the identical Hebrew that is applied in Genesis 1 to all the animals. Living beings. So that in fact, Genesis 1 says exactly the same about man's creation as about the animals. Genesis 2. So whereas chapter 1 says man and the animals are quite different, chapter 2 says man and the animals are exactly the same. And you will not understand man until you put those two things together. Because that's where we are. That's where we came from. We came from the same place as the animals, but we're quite different. And that explains the contradiction, the inconsistencies, the tensions we feel. We know basically that we're the same as animals. We breathe the same air. We have the same kind of blood circulation as every other mammal. We bring our young to birth the same way as every other mammal. We know that. And yet we know deep down, I'm not an animal. I'm not. I'm different. So it's a contradiction and a tension, and we have to live with it. Notice that at first there was only one man and a male one. And if you have problems about God producing life from the dust, then I'm sorry, but you might just miss it happening to you one day. Because resurrection is nothing more than that. And whenever I stand at a graveside when I'm conducting a funeral and say dust to dust, ashes to ashes, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life, I feel like saying to myself, if I can't believe that God made Adam out of dust, then how can I believe that this body will ever be resurrected from the dead? So you see, the whole creation-resurrection thing is all tied up. If you have problems with one, you're going to have problems with the other. And if you can't believe that God did it for Adam, then I question whether you really believe in your own resurrection. It's coming down the line. Because God will really have as big a problem then as he had with Adam, to get your dust together and to get it breathing again. But that's what we say at the funeral service. Right, let me just outline for you now what we're going to cover in the rest of tonight more briefly. Because man is this funny mixture and has this dual origin, being a hybrid, a creature of heaven and earth, a creature both divine and human, both like the animals and unlike them, like God, unlike him, it means that he has certain very tricky relationships to get into. And we're just going to look at 4 relationships that he has to have because he's this dual creature. We're going to look at his relationship with the plant life, with vegetation. Then we'll look at his relationship to God, going to the other extreme. Then we'll come back and look at his relationship to the animal world. And then finally we'll look at his relationship to other human beings. At each of these 4 levels, man will have a unique relationship because he is what he is. And getting those relationships right is the secret of feeling at home in God's world. Now, the first relationship is vegetation. Genesis 2 suddenly goes back to day 3 and says that the earth was not originally a very hospitable environment. There were no plants, wild plants, and no cultivated herbs. And the reason was there was no rain to irrigate and there was no man to cultivate, so you got neither wild plants nor cultivated. That was what it looked like, pretty barren. And you know, when the astronauts came back from the moon and got nearer to the earth, they said the most exciting color that they saw was the color green, because they hadn't seen anything green out in space. And the vegetation of Earth, this is a green planet, and we ought to be jolly thankful it is. But there was a time when it wasn't. There wasn't a blade of grass. There wasn't a single herb anywhere. And then God set about putting that right. The first thing was to get some water in there, and the second one was to get the man in there to cultivate it. And so he began to do it. Now, from now on, attention focuses on only part of the earth. There is a sense I get that God let the plants spread naturally, spontaneously, randomly over most of the earth, but in one part he placed them. That's the sense we get. That therefore you would expect, if you'd been around then, that most of the earth would be as randomly vegetated as it is now. So that seeds just fly around in the wind, settle and grow, and the dandelion grows here and the sycamore there. But in one place, God decided to prepare a park. I much prefer that word to garden. The word garden conveys to me flower beds and things, and that's not what is meant. But the word park conveys exactly what is meant. A very carefully planted place that would have 2 qualities, not only to contain trees that were useful, but an arrangement of them that was beautiful, which tells you this, that man needs an aesthetic as well as a utilitarian environment. Gosh, what a sentence for me. But I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? It's not just enough to have a useful place to live in. Man needs an attractive place to live in. I wish all architects could hear that. But I saw an allotment where among the potatoes the man had planted pansies. And I thought, good for you, you've made a human place. The old cottage gardens in the Middle Ages had the vegetables among the flowers, so that you had a useful and an attractive place. And there are some gardens that are jolly attractive but no earthly use. There are some gardens that are very useful, all nice straight rows of peas, but then they're not attractive. And God made a park that was both for man. For the animals, it was random planting. It didn't need to have beauty. For man, it needed to. Now that says something to me about the environments we create for each other. Our architecture, the town planning. I'd like to get hold of the town planners who plan Basingstoke, or certainly parts of it, and say, did you realize that man needs an attractive as well as a utilitarian place to live? When I see people pushed in these high-rise flats in rabbit hutches, my soul protests. That may be utilitarian, but it's not aesthetic. And so God said for the animals, nature can look after itself. Because an animal doesn't stop and say, hey, what a sunset. But man does. And so God made a parkland, and it was called Delight, or in Hebrew, Eden. The Park of Delight. What a beautiful ring that has. I prefer that to Garden of Eden. The delightful park. That's where man was brought after he was made. And man was brought to it to do two things to it. He was told, develop it and protect it. And therein lies the whole seed of ecology. I love the word husbandry. My first degree was in agriculture, and it was called husbandry, animal husbandry, land husbandry. It's a beautiful word, isn't it? In other words, man is to be a husband to nature. He's to develop it, yes, put his own mark on it, yes, but it must always be to protect it. The trouble is we've often put our mark on nature and destroyed it, like the Dust Bowls of Central America. Man is to develop and protect it, and I'd love to stay with that and just preach about ecology. Because all the modern cry for ecology is rooted and grounded in Genesis chapter 2. That is to be his relationship. He is free to change the shape of nature. He is free to put his own pattern on it. He's free to make farms and fields. He's free to do that. But woe betide him if he doesn't protect it at the same time, if he takes out more than he puts in. That's bad husbandry. Now, the second relationship that I want to touch on is the relationship between man and God. By the way, that Park of Delight was a particular geographical location on a map. It is not a myth. It was a real place. It was somewhere in the mountains of Armenia, north of Mesopotamia, because at least two of the rivers are still there. The other two probably went north to the Caspian and the Black Sea. But the two that are still there, the Tigris and Euphrates, their headwaters are right up in those Armenian hills. That's where the park was. So let's get rid of this myth idea. Why would God tell us where it was if it's a myth? Why would he give us names that we still have if it's all a myth? And there are even hints about the land around it. There was gold here and onyx there, and those have been found. Havilah is to the east of Armenia. Cush was to the north, between the Caspian and the Black Sea. So we're into real geography, real history, real events. So I now come to the relationship with God and those two unusual trees. Because that's when people think you're back into myth again. Right in the middle of the park were two fruit trees. And one had the capacity to lengthen your life indefinitely, and the other had the capacity to shorten it very quickly. That's significant. God put men in a place where eternal life could be his and where he could die like the animals. Now let's look at those two trees together first. Were they magical trees? There's certainly no tree around now with fruit like that. No, they were not magical trees. They were ordinary fruit trees. But they were sacramental trees. Now, I wonder if you know what I mean by that. Let me tell you. In the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, it is ordinary bread and ordinary wine. Yet you could be very ill and even die as the result of taking it. There's nothing magical about the bread and the wine. There's nothing poisonous in them. But Paul says if you eat that bread and drink that wine without discerning the body, then you can eat and drink damnation and judgment to yourself. And he said that's why some of you are sick and some have even died. And we should remember that when we take bread and wine. It's a serious thing. Now, there's nothing magical about the bread and the wine, but God has appointed the eating of that bread as a sacramental act which carries certain spiritual effects and which even carries physical effects. Now, do you see what I mean by sacramental as distinct from magical? The trees are not magical, they are sacramental. They're not, weird and wonderful trees. It's just that God says eating that tree will bring you life, physical life. As eating the bread and drinking the wine wrongly at communion can bring you death. Sacramental. There is nothing more to these trees than that they are sacramentally appointed. The water in baptism is simply H2O. And yet, what can't it wash away? And we know what it can wash away. Because it's sacramental. It's not magic in the water. But God has appointed that act of being immersed as a means of grace. Now are you following me? So the two trees were not magical or mythical. They were two trees that God appointed for certain purposes and said in the act of eating, this is what I've tied to that act. So they are sacraments, one of life, one of death. Now let's look a little more closely. The tree of life simply means this, that man by himself would not live forever, but that the possibility of him doing so was before him. And God was saying sacramentally, that's what I'm offering you, that if you are without that, then you will die like the animals. But you are capable of receiving a life that will go on and on. And still it is true that I am capable of receiving everlasting life from God. I don't have it in me. I'm not immortal. But this mortal can put on immortality. I am capable of living forever. But it's not inherent in me. I have to eat. I have to take something from God to make that possible. Do you follow me? Now that's what the tree stood for. And there are other exciting things that I could go on to say, but there was just one thought I wanted to get hold of there. Yes, the human body, you know, there's no reason why my body should die. It is an incredible machine that is capable of replacing any cells in it that wear out. In fact, every 7 years I change every cell. And the question arises, why can't that just go on? Do you know there is no scientist has yet been able to discover why the clock begins to wind down? Theoretically, this is a self-perpetuating machine, and yet it isn't. Why can the body not just go on, replacing when hair falls out, growing new hair? When skin falls off, growing new skin, because I do that regularly. And when I'm in my prime, I'm pretty good at it, but I'm afraid I'm already into the losing end of the battle. Every time I go to the dentist or the barber, I realize I'm on the losing end of the battle now. Now, why should my body begin to wear out? There is no reason, there's no scientific reason why your body should die. None at all. It's not really a natural event. And you know, that's why the human being says, I'm not made to die. I hate death. If there's one phobia that people have, it's about death. If there's one unmentionable 5-letter word, it's D-E-A-T-H. And we kick against it, we rebel against it, we dress it up like a harvest festival, we refer to people passing away or passing on. And I've noticed that when I say to people, so-and-so's died, they almost jump. If I'd said passed away, that's fine, but they've died. You know? And we hate it. We kick against it because, you know, as one text in the Bible says, God has set eternity in our hearts. And that's why the Russians are looking for the elixir of life. They know we're made for a longer life than we get. Every one of us feels that life is too short for all the things I've hoped for and dreamed about and want to do. And God says, I've put that in your heart, and I've put a tree of life within your reach. And you can have everlasting life, but you don't have it, you must appropriate it. Which means that I'm capable of receiving it. So what could prevent me from receiving it? Well, eating from the other tree. And what is eating from the other tree? What does it mean, this tree of knowledge of good and evil? Well, the word knowledge in Scripture doesn't mean head knowledge. It means experience knowledge. It means having a personal involvement with something. So Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore a son. Now that's not knowing about someone, that's intimately relating. And the tree of knowledge is simply this. It stands for wanting to experience evil as well as good. And even more deeply, it's saying this. What God is saying is this. The condition of your living forever is that you keep your innocence. And you only keep your innocence through obedience. Or in other words, you can't keep your innocence by trying things out for yourself, but by trusting someone else to tell you what is good and what is evil. Trying to spell this out very simply. Let me do it this way. A girl can keep her virginity only by refusing to experience sex before marriage. And therefore by trusting someone to tell her it's wrong to do so. But if she says, I'm going to try it and see if it really is as bad as people tell me, she will lose her innocence and she can never regain it. Therefore, she can't ever choose to be innocent again. Do you follow me? I was glad to see that the present Miss World and the previous one have both chosen to be virgins at the time of their marriage, and neither are married yet. It's quite a new thing for Miss Worlds to be saying this. They have chosen that on the authority of someone else. In both cases, they were both brought up in godly homes. And they were told it's wrong. They have accepted the judgment of someone else, and they are keeping their innocence, and they'll be able to present it at their marriage, which is the best wedding present a bride can give a husband. Now, if they once say, no, I'm going to try both ways, I'm going to try chastity and unchastity, and I will decide what's right and wrong for me, I'm afraid they can't decide. They will inevitably lose their innocence through disobedience. Now, have I explained it fully? And God says, you are free to eat any of the trees. I give you great liberty, but I give you one restraint, that you leave me to decide what's right and wrong for you. And that you don't try to experience things to decide for yourself. Then the whole garden is yours. There will be no loss of happiness through that one tree being restrained, none at all. But the one thing he says I warn you about is this: when you lose your innocence, you cannot live forever, because you will spoil my universe forever. Now, does that all make sense? To me, it's utter sense. Once a person is no longer innocent, they inevitably spoil the rest of their life. They can never be back where they were again. Now, that means God says, innocent people can live forever. They will be a sheer joy. They will enjoy everything. But if you start sampling things you shouldn't, and if you do it because you want to decide what's right and wrong, because you want the personal knowledge of both and make your own decision, then I'm afraid I have to decide at that point that you die. Therefore, death to the human being is a judicial and not a natural event. Do you follow me in that? It is not something that would have happened naturally to the human race. It is a sentence of death. That's why we loathe it. That's why we hate it. Because we know there's something moral in there. The sting of death is sin. That's what spoils it. There's something moral concerned with this. We know we weren't made to die. We feel instinctively that God should be letting us live forever. And we are right in that. He wanted to. But he had to put that restraint, because he said the people I want to live forever are innocent people who can really enjoy my world and will not spoil it. And anybody who spoils it must live temporarily and not permanently. Now that makes a whole lot of sense to me. And we shall see when we study chapter 3 just what went wrong. Because this universe is out of order, that's for sure. But those were the conditions. They're not hard conditions. It does mean that the first commandment God gave to men that was a moral commandment did include the word not in it. And God does say, thou shalt not. But he does it for our good, for our enjoyment. Now, every parent has the same dilemma. Your children grow up and you want to tell them, don't touch that. Don't get into drugs. Don't do this. Don't do that. And your children feel that you want them to live a miserable, narrow, spoiled life. You're doing it because you want them to keep their innocence and enjoy the good things that God has made, right? That's why you're doing it. And every earthly father has that dilemma with his own children. If only they would decide to trust and obey and keep their innocence. But knowing your own heart, you feel your own children will, to a degree, do what you did and say, I'm going to try it for myself. I can remember the first cigarette I had in the bushes. I was sick as a dog. You know? I was 11. I could take it to the bushes now, where I plowed my way through that. More than one, I think, but last weekend, I regretted it. Why was I in the bushes? Because I'd been told not to. I was going to try it. It had one blessed effect. I've never wanted to touch the thing since. But I'm sure that I lost my innocence. And it spoiled something. And you can never wipe that out of your memory or your personality. You can never recover your innocence. I know what it's like to smoke. Can't ever say I don't. Now this was God, and he looked down at this beautiful park and the beautiful person he'd put in it, and he said, I just want you to stay innocent in that park. That's why I've put that tree there. Because I'm going to be the Lord. I'm going to be the boss. I will decide what's right and wrong, but it's for your enjoyment. It's for your good. Will you trust me? If you don't, then I have to warn you, I'm not going to let you spoil this park. Because innocent people don't spoil things. Guilty people do. Well, now that was his relationship to God, and it's very clear. Only to man did God give such a choice. Only to man did God say, now you're responsible for your own life as well as the plants and the animals. And I think you do not treat a man as a human being if you don't treat him as a responsible being. I've sat in courts where people have pleaded that the man in the dock is a poor, innocent victim of his heredity and his environment, and that he's sick and he needs a psychiatrist. He's not responsible for his actions. And I feel you're not treating that man as a man. You're treating him as a machine. And God says you are a human being. You are responsible for your choices. You are responsible. And you treat a man as a man when you treat him as responsible. Now, the third relationship is the relationship to the animals. The relationship to the plants was to develop them and protect them, but not to have any more than that. And I was sad this week on this TV to see a man who had 8,000 cacti in his semi-detached house. Did you see that? And when he was asked why did he have so many, they crowded every inch of his little semi. And when the interviewer said, why do you have so many? He said, well, it's something to talk to at nights. And you know, I felt the hurt of God's heart in that. I felt God saying, I didn't make you to talk to cactus. It's almost as sad when you find a dear old lady who has no relationships except with a cat or a budgie. That's against the will of God. And it's sad. It may not be their fault, but it's not God's will. So the plants, they are there to serve man, to provide food, but they're not to be in a relationship. And if they do get into that position, then there's a distortion of real life. Now, the second group are the animals. Now, there's to be a closer relationship between man and animals. He is to give them names. And to give a name is to express power and authority over a person. That's why school children love to give their teachers names. It gives them a feeling of some power, some getting back at them. But you see, giving a name means that you have authority over it. And so God said to men, since you're in charge of the animals, I'm not going to name the animals. I named you Adam, but you're to name the animals. I'm sure you've heard that lovely story of Adam calling an animal a rhinoceros. And Eve asking him, now, why did you call that a rhinoceros? Well, he said, have you ever seen anything that looked more like a rhinoceros than that? Well, whatever his thinking behind the naming, in fact, most of the names were descriptions. And God said, now, Adam, what do you say about this one? And what he said became its name. And all the early names for animals are actually a description of what they look like or what they sound like. I'll give you some examples. Cuckoo. And what you call a cuckoo is a description of its call. So you just call it the cuckoo. And man gave all the names. Hippopotamus. Hippo is Greek for horse, and potamus is Greek for river. And if ever you've seen a hippopotamus with its head just above water, you see a horse's head. And so it's called the horse of the river. And all the animals' names you can trace back to this. And man was in charge of the animals, so he gave them names. And it's Bellamy's botanic man again. But man is able to analyze, to describe, to label, to categorize. That gives him authority over them. To give a name is to have authority. Nicknames are authority. Numbers of prisoners. I can't bear men being called numbers, but, a prisoner comes under the authority of the prison authorities, and the prison authorities say, you are number 4509. They label that man, and it gives them power over that man. They refer to him like that. In marriage, the wife changes her name, and that is very significant. She changes from one man's name to another man's name, from her father's name to her husband's name, because now she is related to the leadership of another man. It's interesting to see that custom is being attacked now as we get further from God's pattern. But with animals, however much man names an animal, and we haven't got round to naming our ducks yet, but we named our guinea pig, and we named our dog. But nevertheless, it must not and cannot be a full companionship. And where any man, where a husband is fonder of his greyhounds than his children, there is something out of God's will. Do you know, if God was more fond of his pets and his garden than of his children, we'd be in a sad state, wouldn't we? Did you know that every time you worry about anything, every time I worry about anything, I'm libeling God. I'm saying he cares more for his garden and his pets than he does for his children. Jesus said, consider the lilies of the field, how they spin. They toil not, neither do they spin. Consider how they're clothed. Solomon in all his glory wasn't like one of these. And consider the birds of the air, how they're fed. Why then are you worried about tomorrow? What to eat or what to put on? You're saying God cares more for his garden and his pets than for me when you worry. It's quite a thought. So the man noticed these animals and he looked at them and he said, well, that's a cat, that's a dog, that's a horse. There was one word he never used when he named the animals. He didn't call one of them companion. Among all the animals, there was not found a companion for him. And that's why no human being can finally find a fulfilling relationship with an animal or a bird. And if you find yourself closer to an animal than human beings, then you need to seek God again. Or if you know someone like that, maybe you need to ask God if you should be relating to them and breaking their loneliness. All sorts of other things I could say here. This is one of the reasons why buggery is such an abomination to God. It is a relationship that is not right in his sight. I come finally, therefore, to the human relationships. How does man relate to vegetables? How does man relate to animals? How does man relate to God? All those relationships are what I call vertical relationships, either to things below you or someone above you. Relationship to plants and animals are down. Relationship to God is up. But man cannot be fully human without a horizontal relationship. I've heard some Christians say, well, I have a beautiful relationship with the Lord. That's all I need. I've really got a lovely... There's something terrible missing from that person's life. It's all vertical. There's no horizontal. And so Adam could not find a horizontal relationship anyway. Couldn't find it in the animals. Couldn't find it with God. Each of those was vertical, an up and down relationship between a superior and an inferior. To the animals he was superior, to God inferior, but not an equal. And poor old man, as he watched the animals come and named them, he noticed they always came and went in twos. And they seemed to get on very well together, and he felt very lonely. Why can't I have a mate like they all seem to? And God said it is not good for a man to be alone. Do you know Robinson Crusoe? Have you read Robinson Crusoe? He got life well organized on his desert island, and he got really nicely settled in. But he was a lonely man, and one day he saw a human footprint on the beach of Man Friday, and his loneliness was over. But that did not happen to the real Robinson Crusoe, who was a Baptist deacon from Largo in Scotland, Alexander Selkirk. And it was on his life that Robinson Crusoe was based. Daniel Defoe knew that Baptist deacon. And that Baptist deacon was on a ship, and he was cast off on a desert island for 4 years. He had his Bible with him, and much of the things that you read in Robinson Crusoe happened to Alexander Selkirk. The one thing that didn't happen was that there was no other human being. And he was desperately lonely. If you go to Largo in Scotland, you'll see a statue outside the Baptist church up there. It's not good for a man to be alone. And so God said he's got vertical relationships with me, with the animals, but no horizontal ones. And now comes the most tender and beautiful story. Man is never meant to be a soloist or a lone ranger. And here we have the first wedding and the first surgery under anesthetic. It's a glorious story. We'll finish with this tonight. The origin of woman. She was a special creation, not from the dust like the man, but from man. Now, frankly, that certainly won't fit in with evolution. But she was made out of man. But our modern scientific discoveries are showing how possible it is. In 1967, in Oxford, a scientist discovered that one cell taken from the body of a toad, not from its genital organs, but just from its, I think, skin or part of its gut, I think, one cell he discovered actually had in it the tape, the genes for the whole body. It was a unique discovery because it means that every cell of my body could produce my whole body. And if a cell just produces a kidney, it is because in the tape in that cell, everything else but the kidney is switched off. And the kidney bit is allowed to operate. So that from one cell, you can actually produce a whole body. And from that cell in Oxford in 1967, that man produced an entire toad. It was a twin of the toad, or a clone, as he called it, of the whole toad. Without any sexual relationship at all, that cell was made into a total toad. One cell, every cell in my body contains the whole of my body on tape. That little DNA code contains the whole thing. What a discovery. Now, the word rib doesn't occur in the Hebrew. It just says part of the side of Adam, some tissue from his side. And God would simply clone Adam and do what they did in Oxford in 1967, take part of the tissue and produce a twin. The only bit of little genetic engineering he would need to do would be to change the Y chromosome into an X chromosome. That's the tiniest, tiniest little thing, just needs a little extra arm on it. And since each cell in my body is enough not to produce a male body only, but a female as well, again, certain things would be suppressed and certain things developed. All God would need to do would be to take a bit of tissue from Adam's side, change that one chromosome, and Adam's had his operation under an anesthetic. But, boy, that must be a nice thing to come out of an operation to face, mustn't it? And God just closed up. Now, why did God produce woman that way? Well, to say man is incomplete now. He always will be incomplete as a Lone Ranger. He needs to be complemented with another life. And in fact, when you married people make love, just remember, you're putting together again what God separated. That's what it's all about. That's why a man will find this the strongest relationship in his life, stronger even than his relationship with his parents, which is the strongest we have in the first 20 years of our life. But we're prepared to break that and to leave father and mother and cleave to someone we feel is completing us where they couldn't. And it all goes back to God cloning Adam and producing an identical twin who was female. And Adam, whether he'd seen his own reflection in a pond or not, I don't know, but when he looked at Eve, he said, "This is it." That's literally the translation. This is it. This is all there in the Hebrew. It's a lovely thing. And if you can imagine, since she was his twin, here were Adam and Eve looking at each other, same features, made for each other, made from each other, and knowing they just had to be one. It's an amazing thought. And from that comes the whole of our thinking about marriage. Whenever Jesus got into arguments about divorce, he would always come back to this part of the story and appeal to what happened from the beginning. Here is the basis. Every wedding you go to, this is where it started. Here's a lovely comment by a saint called Matthew Henry. He said, "When God made woman, he did not take her out of man's head to lord it over him, nor out of his feet to be trampled on by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, from under his arm to be protected by him, and from near his heart to be loved by him." That's quite a sermon, isn't it? Beautiful comment. Let me just tell you 12 things about marriage that are all here, and I'll just give them to you in sentences. 1, sex is good. It's beautiful. God made it, and he said, that's very good. Don't you ever libel God in that. Number 2, it is for partnership before it is for parenthood. That has a whole implication for contraception. But when God made sex, he didn't make it in man primarily to have children, but for man to have companionship. Therefore, making love is not primarily to have children. That's a profound thing to say. It is primarily as a sacrament of love. It is an expression of we belong to each other. Thirdly, man is incomplete by himself and needs a complementary partner. That's why the language like my better half, my other half, my alter ego, all makes sense. Fourth, man was prior to the woman, but is not superior. In Genesis one, man and woman, both are in the image of God. Spiritually, they are equal. Functionally, they are not, but spiritually they are. In value, status, everything, both are in the image. Fifth, God's pattern for marriage is monogamy. One man marries one woman. Therefore, polygamy, many wives, or polyandry, many husbands, not God's will. I love the schoolboy who said, to be married to one person for life is monotony. He nearly got it right. It's monogamy, all right? Number six, marriage has a legal and social side as well as a physical. There is an official leaving one home and cleaving to start another. Therefore, it is not just enough to say we're going to live together. What's marriage? It's just a bit of paper. It's just a legal fiction. It is very important that marriage is to be seen as a social as well as a physical thing. You are actually breaking certain relationships and entering into others, and therefore a wedding is proper. It is right that it should be recognized by society that this woman is not under the authority of her father now, but under her husband. There is a leaving and a cleaving. And the father of the bride saying, I give this woman to this man, is as important as the physical consummation. Therefore, all this talk about, it's only a bit of paper, that's ridiculous in God's sight. It is a social as well as a personal and physical thing. Next, cleaving is the physical consummation. Two bodies becoming one again is the actual seal of the marriage. And that's why most laws recognize the nullity of a marriage that has not been consummated. So does the Bible. 8, marriage takes precedence over all other relationships. A person's first duty is to their marriage partner. And all the jokes about in-laws have some truth in there, where the mother or father of either partner is having more influence on that partner than the other partner. There is something seriously wrong. And if a couple are finding themselves in that because the mother-in-law or father-in-law lives nearby, I would advise that couple to move house and to get away, because the marriage relationship must take precedence over all others. A man shall leave his father and mother. Number 9, marriage is permanent. There is no divorce. When Jesus was asked about divorce, he referred people right back to the beginning and cleaving together, which means holding on. From the very first word of the Bible, loyalty is a vital ingredient of love. And all thinking about separation must start with Genesis 2. Number 10, the husband is the leader of the marriage. Not the dictator, but the leader. He has that responsibility, and it's expressed in the fact that he gives the name to his wife. Right from Genesis 2, Adam named her. And when we married, my wife took my name. I gave my name to her. So it is not a democracy of two, neither is it a dictatorship of one. It's a leadership of three, in which the husband is the head of the wife and Christ is the head of the husband. And I think a wife who has a husband whose head is Christ will be willing to accept him as her head. It is only when he is not under Christ that he will become a dictator. 11, the primary function of a wife is to help her husband. She is to be a helper. It's not two people with totally independent careers and ambitions sharing one house because it's cheaper and one bed because it's nice. Primarily, the wife is to be the helper of her husband. And if she is, God will enable her to find her fullest fulfillment in that very high calling. 12, the ideal in marriage is such complete freedom and ease with each other that you have nothing to hide. That last sentence is beautiful. They walked around with no clothes at all, without the slightest embarrassment. In other words, neither of them distrusted the other. Neither of them feared that anything they showed to each other would be abused or ridiculed. They were totally trusting. That, of course, has never been the same since. And nudism cannot now be natural, nor ever will be again. In heaven we shall need clothes, as we shall see next time. Let me finish. Let's just put that final transparency up. We have seen an almost idyllic scene in Genesis 1 and 2 of man in a park of delight, of everybody in beautiful surroundings, of a marriage that's perfect, the whole thing. It's interesting that the Greek word for park is paradisos, from which we get paradise. And when you read Genesis 2, you think, oh, that must have been beautiful. It's a romantic dream. What went wrong? Of the three major relationships, man's relationship below him to the creatures, alongside him to his companion, and up to his Creator, those three relationships in which he would submit himself to the one above, submerge himself in the one alongside, and subdue those that were beneath. What went wrong? One of those three went terribly wrong. Now, it's interesting that there is a whole new movement of people today who say the real thing that is wrong is our relationship to our environment. And these people are devoting themselves to saving the whale and saving trees. And you know the conservationist thrust there is. Some people are devoting their whole lives to trying putting man's relationship with nature right again. And then there are others who say, no, that's not the key one. The key one is reconciliation with our fellow men, to stop destroying each other. The women at Greenham Common protesting it, they're part of this. That the real thing that's gone wrong is the horizontal one, our attitudes to each other, the whole destructive alienation from each other. But the Bible's answer is that it was the one that went up that went wrong. And that conservation is not the answer, and reconciliation is not the answer at the human level. Salvation is the answer. And that once that one goes wrong, the other two also go wrong. That if you are not rightly submitting to the Lord and letting Him choose right and wrong and keep your innocence, then you can't have a marriage in which you're unashamed in each other's presence. Nor can you have a relationship with God's creatures that will not get out of balance and will not be exploitive. So that's really preparing us for the very next stage in the story, the true story of the history of our race. Why are we living in a world out of order? Which relationship went wrong? And we'll pick up the story next time.